Welcome to the Madness and Grace podcast, where we explore the connection between mental health and faith. I'm Dr. Matthew Stanford, neuroscientist, author, and mental health advocate.
And I'm Dr. Madeline Stiers, a therapist and trauma researcher. We're so glad you're joining us today. Each week, we have authentic conversations about personal stories, we share professional insights, and explore the meaningful ways faith can influence mental well-being.
Whether you're seeking comfort, understanding, or simply a new perspective, we're here to journey with you. Thanks for tuning in. Now let's dive into today's conversation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Madness and Grace podcast. Maddie and I are happy to have you join us again. We have an interesting conversation today on an often misunderstood set of diagnostic criteria, descriptions of behavior. Those are kind of the problems here is what really are psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, and how do you engage somebody that has those if they're in your family or it's someone that you might be married to? And what does that look like from a clinical perspective? So those are the kind of things we're going to be talking about today. And also, I'm sure we'll throw in what's one of the hottest topics around today for some reason, which is the idea of narcissism, because that's a huge component of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. Do you have any opening thoughts, Maddie?
I think you hit the nail on the head. Narcissism is a buzzword that's been going around. People talk about it. And, while people can have, malintent and behaviors that they're doing towards their partners or their friends, or they may be trying to manipulate you, the idea of like narcissism and antisocial personality disorder, the things that we're going to go into today are actual diagnoses that that are given by providers. And
Right.
Just like we kind of, in the late 90s, early 2000s, everyone had ADHD. I think we're seeing everyone is kind of armchair diagnosing themselves or their exes and whatnot as narcissists. So, yeah.
No, I agree. And, in narcissism, there certainly is a narcissistic personality disorder, but that has a set of criteria that you have to meet. And it's actually quite rare in relationship to other mental health problems. And you certainly could have narcissistic traits. And it's the same thing with the things we'll talk about today. So let me just give a couple of definitions here, a kind of description, so we get a sense of really what we're talking about. So antisocial personality disorder, you hear that a lot, and that is an actual DSM-5, a diagnostics manual diagnosis, and it is characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others, deceitfulness, impulsivity, and a lack of remorse. And so a lot of times people that have antisocial personality disorder have been involved with criminality, substance use, things like that. They really do have a real disregard for rules and the rights of others. They will take advantage of other individuals. But antisocial personality disorder can manifest in different ways in different people. So there's a set of criteria in the diagnostics manual, but not everyone will demonstrate it in exactly the same way. It is a disorder that's much more common in men than in women. And, you're really looking at probably somewhere between 1 to maybe 3% of the population. I mean, it's a fairly rare in relationship to other mental health problems. One of the things you have to think about with antisocial personality disorder, this is not something like depression that you're 27 years old and then all of a sudden you just start manifesting it. Individuals who have antisocial personality disorder, by definition, have to have had conduct disorder as an adolescent. So they are already showing the signs of this disorder, that kind of disregard for rules and for the rights of others, and deceitfulness and impulsiveness and things like that. They're already showing that as an adolescent, even as an older child. So that has to be in place for a person to be able to be diagnosed with it. And then they would obviously have to be diagnosed with it at 18 or later. So this is a disorder of adults. And then psychopathy, or what a lot of times people just refer to as a psychopath, that's really more of a descriptive category. It's not a diagnosis. There are some criteria, but they'll vary from person to person. And antisocial personality disorder is just not exactly the same thing. Antisocial personality disorder, the criteria for that are a component of what we would call psychopathy or being a psychopath. But when you talk about psychopathy, you also have to add in a lot of affective traits like a lack of empathy. That's where you hear that a lot, where a person doesn't really get it, that that's hurting someone else, that that's a bad thing. They have a lot of superficial charm. They're very manipulative, much more so than someone with antisocial personality disorder. So one is a kind of a characteristic description. Another is an actual diagnosis. There actually is no diagnosis for being a psychopath. That doesn't exist. And so when we call someone a psychopath, we can use some criteria, and antisocial personality disorder criteria are part of that. But that's really more just a description of a set of behaviors and feelings or lack thereof feelings.
And when we think about someone with antisocial personality disorder, they're typically overrepresented in jail and prison populations, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
because there's just this, from a young age, a disregard for authority and rules, kind of this dismissal of those don't apply to me. I don't have to actually follow those rules. They're for other people. And so someone with antisocial personality disorder, you see consistently breaking the law. I mean, in large, small and
Or
large
rules,
ways.
right.
And rules, right.
And some would argue, and this is an area that I worked in for a long, long time, worked with a lot of inmate populations and things like that. I mean, some would argue that you have an overrepresentation of antisocial personality disorder in the prison population, not because people with antisocial personality disorder are more likely to commit crimes, but because people that commit crimes are more likely to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, because that's the way that criteria are written. Does that make sense? I mean, so because in the criteria, it talks about breaking rules and be involved with criminality and things like that. So just kind of by definition, once you do that, you're already closer to being able to meet the criteria. So you do find very high rates in the male prison population, which again, sometimes that is a problem, because if you have a diagnosis that is particularly within a subgroup of the population is so high in prevalence, that just basically kind of most everyone has it within that group, it to some extent kind of becomes meaningless, because, what do you do? I mean, and so it's that's been a lot of problems with the disorder. The disorder it's a difficult disorder. It also has a real male twist to it, the way it's written. There's it just is written in such a way that what might manifest in a woman would not be along the lines of this. So a lot of times you find a bias in diagnosis, where women are more likely to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and men are more likely to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. And one of the things I would say, and you might want to speak to this too, Maddie, from a clinical perspective, is, one thing that I think most people don't realize is both of those personality disorders fall under what we would call cluster B personality disorders. Those are antisocial, borderline, histrionic personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. And there is such a tremendous overlap between the criteria in those that sometimes it's quite difficult to differentiate them from one another.
It is interesting, though, with borderline personality disorder, you do see more people coming to treatment, even men who have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, but women are more often diagnosed with borderline. So, but people who have been diagnosed with borderline, there might be this idea that all of the problems in their lives are other people's, and they may kind of take this hands-off approach to trying to understand problems. But they are open to therapy in the sense that I need help, I need some support, my life is crumbling around me. Well, when we think of, antisocial personality disorder, they really oftentimes are very uninterested in any sort of treatment or therapy. I don't need it. Like, there's nothing.
Right. They very rarely ever show up looking for help in relationship to their problem.
Yeah. So when when you think about, a lot of these overlapping criteria, and they're all in that same cluster in the DSM. It's interesting because there are some things that pull them apart. And yeah, I
I
mean, I
think
met with a young individual once whose parents brought them in and had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. And he kind of just his parents were so concerned and wanted him to get treatment. They had done a lot of research, and I went through intake or screening and to understand if our services would be beneficial, because there is some research that shows DBT can be helpful for antisocial.
dialectical behavior therapy can be helpful.
Yeah, if they engage. And this person was young enough. I mean, they were over 18, but they were young enough to where they still were very much like, meh, I'm not interested in that.
Right.
And their affect was me. And I kind of was like, I think I asked him, I said, are you going to do anything? If we bring you into this program, are you going to do any of the homework? He was, no, I don't think so.
No. Why would I?
And they were really honest. It was really interesting.
Because
Yeah.
they don't
He
really
was
see a need
not
for it.
interested in this. He was like, frankly, I think it's stupid. And they went,
Within that cluster, there's an A cluster, a B cluster, and a C cluster. Within that B cluster, which are the four that I just mentioned, antisocial and narcissistic are clearly, there's a diagnostic bias or diagnosis bias towards males.
Yeah.
And they're the least likely to go get help. They don't see a need for help. Whereas
Men are more
histrionic
like, men are less likely to get help
anyway.
anyway.
But histrionic and borderline, their lives are such chaos, and they see most of the problems externally, and there's a bias towards diagnosing those in women, and they're more likely to go get help. So, but they're all very difficult to treat. I mean, I think that's the important thing. Personality disorders are deeply ingrained kind of character problems where, really, in a sense, you might say, I'm kind of really making this very simplistic when I say this, but the person's personality has formed wrong. And they, there certainly can be biological aspects to that. There's certainly environmental aspects to it. We know that for a fact. And their personality has formed wrong. And really what has to happen is you have to kind of retrain the individual on how to perceive things, how to respond to things, how to accept or not accept. I mean, and so it's tough. It's really tough. In fact, when I was in grad school, and I'm getting older every day, it was just flat out taught to us that if you had a personality disorder, there was virtually nothing that could be done except long-term psychoanalysis, which was not effective in most instances. At least now we have things like dialectical behavior therapy, which have been shown to be effective. So that's antisocial. Had a little talk. We'll come back to that in a second. So now we kind of go on the other side, and we talk about what people refer to as a psychopath. And a lot of times people will call someone with antisocial personality disorder a psychopath. Well, one thing I want to say about antisocial before I jump over to psychopath is you do not have to be aggressive to meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. So do understand that just because someone has antisocial personality disorder does not mean they are violent or have ever shown a violent act. That's not necessary. There is a criteria in there that they might meet, but it's like, you have to have 3 of this and 2 of that kind of a thing. So, and the same thing with psychopaths. You don't have to be violent to be a psychopath. You just have to have kind of a set of characteristics in how you perceive and respond to the world. So you lack remorse or empathy for anything you do. You don't care about the feelings of others, or you don't care about the consequences for what you do. You really don't have anxiety, in the sense that, why do you not speed? Well, you don't speed because you're concerned that you might get a ticket and you don't want to pay you don't have the money to pay the ticket and all that kind of stuff. Well, they don't have anxiety for that. They don't care. So it's not, it's not that they don't know that they shouldn't speed. Yes, that's the law. I shouldn't do that. But I mean, if I get caught, I get caught. I don't care, so, and so, that lack of empathy, a lot of manipulation, very charismatic, kind of superficial charm. And as I say that, you might think, well, wait a minute. I mean, if the person was not violent and they were highly intelligent, they might be able to be quite successful with that. And sadly, in our society, that's true. In fact, what you find is that a lot of people that can rise to very high level positions can be very psychopathic because they're, for instance, the example that's given a lot of times is the CEO that's brought into a Fortune 500 company that is going under. And this is a special kind of person who's brought in who's basically going to cut spending, and they're going to be able to turn this thing around. And then they probably will move on after that. So the guy comes in and he has to lay off 20,000 people in one day, knowing that when you suddenly lay off 20,000 people, you damage a lot of families, a lot of individuals, but they just do it as if it's nothing. It takes a special person to be able to do that. So there can be kind of, I don't know if I would say beneficial aspects to it. So it's not always that the psychopath is a criminal. Even a person that, for instance, again, I'm not, in no way am I saying these individuals are psychopathic, but when you are a Navy SEAL or a special combat kind of commando type of thing, you have to have very low levels of anxiety. You cannot get anxious in these situations, or you will get injured or injure your team.
I think that's an important comment to expound on, the anxiety aspect of it.
Absolutely.
If I'm speeding, like me personally, and I know I'm speeding, I'm like, okay, where are the
You're
cops?
looking
Like,
around.
There's a bit of hesitation happening. Or if I'm going into a conversation with a coworker, I know the person's going to be upset or something. There's maybe some anxieties leading up to those events and that happen during the course of those events, where someone with antisocial tendencies or psychopathy, they're not going to experience the standard anxiety.
Not at all.
That a person might in those situations. Yeah. So yeah,
I'll give you an example from research. I've actually done quite a bit of research with psychopaths and people with antisocial. So there's a paradigm. It's an anticipatory anxiety paradigm. It's one of the very first paradigms used with psychopaths. And so what you do is psychopath sits in front of a screen and you have their skin wired up on their hand. You're going to do a skin conductance. So you're going to run a very low level electrical impulse through their skin and pick it up on another electrode. And the change in the conductivity of their skin is really based on how much sweat there is in their, how much they're sweating, and how much you're sweating is a measure of how anxious you are. And so they don't feel that electrical current. So on their other hand, you have an actual electrode where you're going to really shock the snot out of them when something happens. Okay. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. I mean, it's a painful shock. Okay. So, and what you do is you do a countdown paradigm. So on the screen is a countdown, like 10, 9, 8, so forth. And so you're measuring their skin conductance, which is really a measure of anxiety response, physiological arousal. Mm-hmm. And you're measuring that every time the number comes up. And it's already been explained to them that let's say you're doing a countdown, when the number 0 comes up, they will be shocked. Okay. And you shock them to let them know what the shock's going to feel like. Okay. So what you find is, as the numbers on a normal individual that isn't psychopathic, as the number is decreasing and getting closer to 0, they're
getting more anxious.
This is getting higher and higher and higher. They're getting more and more anxious. They're having what's referred to as anticipatory anxiety. Mm-hmm. Okay. They're anticipating what's going to happen. They're getting fearful. Okay. That's normal. And so then you shock them, and then it goes back down to normal. And then if you're doing it again, it just starts building back up. For the psychopath, it's like a flat line. There's no change between 10 and 1. There's no difference. It's only when you shock them that they show any change in skin conductance, and then it goes right back down to nothing. Mm-hmm. So they do not, even though they know absolutely that you're going to shock them and absolutely it's going to hurt, their body doesn't respond. It's a part of a brain in the brain called the amygdala. It just doesn't respond the same way. They just don't perceive threats the same way, and they don't perceive threat of negative consequences or things like that. So they can hurt your feelings, and they have no concern or problem with that. And so I think a lot of times, at least within the research literature, it's kind of thought that psychopathy is a more innate or biologically driven phenomenon, whereas antisocial personality disorder is probably more of an environmentally driven. Not to say that each doesn't have components of the other, but one is more environmental, kind of learned. One is more innate. So some might say, well, you're kind of born psychopathic, but you kind of learn to be antisocial. But again, that simplifies it a little bit.
And then you have narcissistic personality disorder, which is another one that I think a lot of people, if you're on social media at all, you see people, everyone's a narcissist, everyone's this, that, and the other. And really, I think people don't know the difference between, antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and someone who's just not very nice to them, who isn't treating them well, who maybe does not have good relational skills. I mean, it's narcissistic personality disorder, again, is a diagnosable disorder in the DSM that is primarily driven by someone's grandiosity, feeling like they're special or other people think they're special. And some of the characteristics with antisocial overlap.
Absolutely.
Like manipulative behavior, kind of disregard for others. There's a bit more of like a focus on self-centeredness and a narcissistic diagnosis. They may or may not be violent, but the focus is not so much of a disregard for rules and authority, as you see in antisocial, but it's more of a self-centered focus on I am this special being, this grandiose sense of self that other people should acknowledge and recognize. Or if they don't, they're upset about that.
And then there are problems. So I find, I'm going to say this, this is going to get me in trouble when I say this, but I find that a lot of people will refer to a relative they have or someone they know as narcissistic when they actually are more antisocial. Because narcissistic is kind of a component of that. And they're kind of over exaggerating in some sense the egocentric, the self-focus. And also narcissism has actually, within the literature on psychopathy, been referred to as the core of psychopathy, that it's impossible to be a psychopath without being narcissistic. It's just kind of a default. So then these things overlap so much, but I have more often than not seen, in fact, I can honestly tell you, I've never seen someone say someone was antisocial and they were actually narcissistic, because people don't know what that is. They don't even know what antisocial is. But I've had a lot of, particularly women, approach us here at the Hope and Healing Center and say, well, my husband or my boyfriend or my uncle or my father, they're narcissistic. And, it's more often than not, they're not.
Right.
Sometimes they're antisocial. And I've said it before using a little bit more colorful language, but you don't have to be narcissistic personality disorder to be a jerk.
It's true.
So, you can be a real jerk and not have the personality disorder diagnosis. Just like you can be a real jerk and be involved in criminality and be really impulsive and things like that and not be antisocial personality disorder. I would also say that the overlap between antisocial personality disorder and substance use is extremely high. It is really quite rare to come across someone who has antisocial personality disorder that hasn't had a substance use problem or doesn't actually have one. And that's not true with psychopathy. You just don't see that with psychopathy. You certainly have psychopaths that have substance use problems, but the overlap with antisocial personality disorder is extremely high. So, and then also, as I said, with antisocial personality disorder, you have to have a diagnosis of conduct disorder as an adolescent to meet criteria for antisocial. It's similar with psychopathy. A lot of times what it's referred to as the child was callous and unemotional, which is so they lack empathy as an older child or adolescent. They've begun to be manipulative and things like that. So, but again, beyond what children are normally manipulative, beyond the normal of manipulative. So, so let's talk a little bit about, what families might do if they have a loved one that has this, because obviously this exists and these people all have families, and how is a family supposed to kind of navigate this? I think that, There's two things that come to mind that I think we're going to probably talk more than anything about, and I'll just throw them out there and I'll let you just pick which one you want to run off with, okay? And that would be enabling and boundaries.
Boundaries. I'm a big boundaries person. Yeah. Those are opposite ends of the spectrum, enabling and boundaries, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't talk about one without talking about the other.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, setting up boundaries with someone who has these diagnoses is the same in some sense as setting boundaries with anybody else. You know, you have to decide what they are. You have to understand when someone has crossed into them.
Right.
And it can be a bit more challenging in the sense that they may disregard them and likely will.
Right. Right.
You know, so what is that going to look like, and how? So the boundaries that you might set with someone need to be a little bit more intense. You know, and expect that they are going to disregard them and be,
because they don't appreciate the consequence. They know what the consequence is, but they don't care.
Mm-hmm.
You know, okay,
yeah,
do that. You know, so
yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of it's a challenge. Setting boundaries with anybody is a challenge, but especially, you know, you're trying to set up boundaries with this person that you love, and they don't really care. And
by definition, their problem is they like to violate boundaries.
Right.
They don't like to. They're
not following the rules, you know, and these are essentially, boundaries are essentially your own personal rules for conduct.
Right.
And that can be a different level of painful, right? You've got someone who you care about and love that says, yeah, I don't care, you know, that this is what you're asking of me. I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. So how do you handle that? I mean,
no, it's difficult. And I think you have to choose which boundaries you want to put in place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you have to absolutely follow through on those boundaries. And really what I'm talking about a lot of times, because we're talking about antisocial personality here primarily. A lot of these behaviors can be very dangerous and harmful. So if somebody displays them, you know, say within your home or something, it might be necessary for that person not to live there anymore. But I'll give you an example of just like something I've told a family before in this context, and you can respond to that, good or the bad. For instance, as I told you, substance use is heavily overlaps with antisocial personality disorder. So to tell the antisocial personality disorder individual, you will not use drugs. If you use drugs, that's it. You can't live here, or whatever the consequence is, or you cannot drink alcohol. If I find out you drink alcohol, you know, that kind of thing, that's unrealistic is what that is until they begin to make progress. What I've recommended to a family is you will not have drugs in this home. You will not consume alcohol in this home. If I find drugs in this home, I will call the police and turn those drugs in. But so that's different than telling someone they can't use. You're not saying that you want them to use, but if they're going to use, they will not do it within the four walls of your home. And if they do, then you will call and turn the drugs in. And so,
well, Matt, isn't that enabling them to do drugs?
Right. Well, no, it's not enabling. That's a little bit different. Okay. So enabling is a little different, but see, a lot of times people aren't, that's a good point. I mean, a lot of times people aren't comfortable with that. I don't want them to use drugs anymore. Well, I don't want them to use drugs anymore either.
Right.
But we're trying to set up boundaries so that we can begin to make progress. And, if we just say, okay, you're not going to do these 10 things ever again, well, they're going to do those in an hour. You know, I mean,
and we're talking about these boundaries being set with someone who has been diagnosed with this personality disorder, that a professional, licensed mental health professional has diagnosed them. Because what you're saying is very different, a very different boundary that you might set with someone who has depression, anxiety, some trauma, and is using substances to cope with that mental health difficulty.
Absolutely.
So I just want to be clear. This is not a boundary that you set with other people struggling with their mental health. This is very specific to this diagnosis.
I think you really, I think that's a good point, and I think it's a point we should make a lot on this podcast, is boundaries are always an important part of mental health recovery. And I think boundaries are diagnosis specific and person specific. And I think they have to be looked at that every time. So
Sure.
you look at the person, you look at the diagnosis, and they might differ from a person with the same diagnosis. It's a different person. The other thing is that you made a good point there is that, we're talking about someone who's actually been diagnosed with this. I've never met anyone named Dr. Google, and Dr. Google is not a good diagnostician. Okay. And so you do not diagnose your relatives with antisocial personality disorder and then start telling them they have antisocial personality disorder. That's just not helpful. Now, we've already said, and we'll say again, people with antisocial personality disorder are not interested in getting help. They do not show up at clinics. I mean, virtually every person that I ever worked with at one point in my career for years, decades, I only worked with people who had antisocial personality disorder.
Hmm.
And virtually every one of them was, for some reason, somehow court mandated or forced into care. And so, this is not something people just show up and go, oh yeah, I'm a criminal, I have a substance use problem, I don't care what other people think, but I want to be better. Because why would I want to be better if I don't care? Because I don't think I really have a problem. You have a problem. So you just want, you're just not doing what I want you to do. Just do what I want you to do. So I think that's an important part. So let's talk about enabling a little bit. Enabling, the most classic with antisocial personality disorder is that, or even with psychopathy as well, if we're looking at that as more of a diagnostic set of characteristics, these people can be highly manipulative and they lie. Okay. And at some point, they're manipulating you and they're lying to you. So, the person with antisocial personality disorder is asking you for money every month. And that as soon as you give them money, they're going out to buy drugs. Well, if you're just giving them money so that they'll leave you alone or they'll blow up and that'll keep them from blowing up, but they're going to go buy drugs, you're enabling their drug use. I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, it's just, you're only, in some sense, you're giving them the money to make yourself feel better because they'll leave you alone.
Well, and
it's
you're
hard.
Teaching them that you will give them the money.
Absolutely.
And why would they stop asking?
And so you just have to not reward, the classic line is don't reward bad behavior. If I had a family that I work with, a young man I don't think he had full-blown antisocial personality disorder, but he was involved in a lot of kind of negative behaviors. But, they would just send him money because he lived in another town. But when they went and looked at his apartment, he was living in squalor. He's a drug user. He's basically buying drugs every time they said, well, but, we're trying to take care of him. How else are we supposed to take care of him? We have to give him money to buy. Well, he's not buying. So what you do is you purchase his groceries for him. I mean, you spend the money for him. Don't give him money for his rent. Pay his rent. There's a difference,
Yeah.
And so I don't put cash into the hands of somebody who uses heroin on a regular basis because I know where that's going. So there's ways to get around this to keep you from enabling an individual. And the other thing is, I would say this, and this is your point that you made before, you can't enable a mental illness, like depression or schizophrenia. So you don't, that's a different kind of phenomenon here. We're talking about person kind of involved in negative behaviors that are harmful to themselves or others. I mean, if someone's delusional, you're not enabling that by paying their rent or whatever, giving them money to pay their rent. So there's a little bit of a difference there. You don't just kind of think of this as one thing and it kind of goes to everything. So those are two things. Yeah, go ahead.
Say getting, we're giving you some ideas of how to set boundaries and how to prevent enabling of someone who's struggling with this. But if this is you, if you know someone and you're struggling with this, find a therapist if you don't have one already.
Absolutely.
I mean, get yourself some support because it is just like anything else. If you're caregiving or loving a person who is struggling with this, I mean, get some support because setting and holding those boundaries and stopping enabling behavior is definitely challenging, especially when you're working through this with someone who has manipulative tendencies. I mean, it just adds another layer of complexity to it.
Getting yourself in a good group that can educate you about the illness and offer you support can make all the world and the difference for you and for your loved one.
Right.
I think another thing we just have to keep in mind or make sure that you understand is that while this is very hurtful to you and to the rest of the family, the individual that has this disorder or this set of characteristics simply does not appreciate that. It doesn't affect them in the same way. So kind of pleas to the hurt that they're causing, things like that really oftentimes meaningless because they just don't, their brain literally does not pick up on emotions the same way. And so their lack of remorse, lack of empathy, really, it's not that they just, well, I don't really care that it's hurting you. They don't, but it's that they don't understand what it is to be hurt like that, particularly for the psychopath.
Yeah.
Yes, psychopaths are very good at mimicking emotions, but they can't feel the emotions. But they can mimic them very well. They can act sad. They can act angry. They watch others and try to figure out what it is that they're supposed to be, how they're supposed to be behaving.
And that's oftentimes what's taught in treatment when you get someone who's actually willing to jump into treatment is you're not going to ever feel these same emotions to the same level or even at all that someone who doesn't have this is going to experience those emotions. So oftentimes they're taught to mirror emotions. And so you want to have relationships, you want to engage in the world, you have to do that in the way that other people, this our social construct is. And how do you do that? You have to be able to, one, interpret and understand emotion, and then reciprocate those behavioral responses to emotions.
And when they're mimicking those emotions, they don't feel them.
Right. They don't feel them. And when you talk with someone who's gone and either figured it out on their own or gotten, treatment for this, they'll say that. They say, I don't feel it, but I know what needs to be done and said. But again, that can be thought of as kind of like they have this ability to manipulate people, but they're using it for good once they've been to that.
And, one of the things I would say is that, we're describing these problems with emotion and behavior, and this doesn't give people an excuse for bad behavior. Bad behavior is bad behavior, and it's not acceptable, particularly aggressive, violent behavior. And so it might be necessary for this person not to live with you. And you don't just go, well, I know that they hurt me all the time, but they have antisocial personality disorder, so it's not their fault. Well, it's certainly true that it's more difficult for them to control their behavior, perhaps, but that's not an excuse for you to allow them to abuse you. So I think that's a difficult thing. And a lot of times people within faith communities might say something, well, you need to forgive them and things like that. And yes, that might be necessary for you, or might even be a call for you to forgive them and understand why they are the way they are. But that being said, it doesn't mean that I'm going to forgive you and then just allow you to do it to me again.
Absolutely not. That's, yeah.
So it's a little, as we get towards the end here, I know I was talking to you about this earlier this week as we were getting ready to do this. So I've always been very fascinated by behavioral descriptions in the Bible. And so, if the authors of the Bible were anything, they were great observers of behavior. And so there are a couple of very interesting descriptions in the Bible that on the surface really look like young men that are showing a lot of the same kind of behaviors and thought patterns of someone with antisocial personality disorder. I'm not saying that they have antisocial personality disorder. I'm just saying that they're very similar. So let me read one for you here. First, in fact, in the rabbinical literature, the rabbis say that these two descriptions are actually the same person, but I'll read them as separate individuals. First, I'll read out of Ezekiel. This is Ezekiel 18, 10 to 13 or so. And this is referred to as the violent son. Then he may have a violent son who sheds blood and who does any of these things to a brother, though he himself did not do any of these things. That is, he even eats at the mountain shrines and defiles his neighbor's wife, oppresses the poor and needy, commits robbery, does not restore a pledge, but lifts up his eyes to the idols and commits abomination. He lends money on interest and takes an increase. Will he live? He will not live. He has committed all these abominations. He will surely be put to death. His blood will be on his own head. It's a very interesting description. I mean, it literally talks about somebody who is violating social norms, someone who is involved in sexual assault, someone who oppresses people that are weaker than him, takes advantage of them. He robs people. He lends money, but then forces them to pay him back some extreme interest. He lies. I mean, it is a fascinating description. And then there's another description in Deuteronomy 21:18-21. This is called the stubborn and rebellious son. If any man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, and this is a reference to an adult, actually, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them, then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of his hometown. They shall say to the elders of the city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death, so that he shall remove the evil from their midst, and all Israel will hear of it and fear. I am not suggesting that people with antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy be stoned to death. I'm just reading these stories. But the thing is that, again, there's a description. He's involved in impulsive behaviors. He's a drunkard. So I read those for this point. This isn't new. Okay, this isn't like something that somebody just came up with for the diagnostics manual. These are patterns of behaviors that have existed since the dawn of time. And when they appear in kind of clusters like this within a single individual, they're extremely problematic for the individual, for the family that they're in, and for the society that they live in. And that is, I think, why in these biblical passages, the description of these kind of antisocial or psychopathic individuals, that the actual kind of punishment at the end of that is that they're stoned to death, because they have to be removed from the community they're in because they are so problematic and they are damaging and harming other individuals. So I say that only so you get the sense of the severity of these illnesses. It may be necessary for you to kind of shield yourself from them and your family. It may not be possible for you to have a normal kind of familial relationship with them. Doesn't mean you have to completely cut it off, but it can be very, very difficult.
And you might even say we are doing that as a society in the sense that people find themselves imprisoned.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the whole point. They're going to be removed from society for some period of time. So, and then, I think we could do a whole podcast on how effective do we think it is that you take a bunch of people who lack remorse and have these boundary issues and manipulate and take advantage of each other, and we stick them all into a giant warehouse. And somehow we think that's going to go really well, and so
maybe they'll learn from that.
Right, and it does really get to the idea of rehabilitation because, as I said, I worked with inmates for a long time, and the core of rehabilitation is fear of punishment. You're going to rehabilitate yourself so you don't come back here because this is a bad place, and if you don't have the neural functioning to perceive that in the appropriate emotional way, it's meaningless.
Yeah.
Meaningless. So,
interesting. Well, thanks, Matt. I think your expertise in this topic is something that a lot of listeners are really going to enjoy. I think it was a good conversation and just kind of a hot topic right now. People are interested in understanding these kind of on the edge type people. And so I appreciate all that. And for all of you listeners joining us again this week, join us for our next episode as well. Send us an email if you have any comments, and we will see you next time on Madness and Grace. Thanks for joining our conversation on this episode of the Madness and Grace podcast. If you found value in our discussion today, we'd love it if you'd subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode.
And if you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving us a rating and review. It helps others find these important conversations.
Sharing this podcast with friends and family members is also a wonderful way to extend hope to those who might be struggling with mental health concerns.
We'll be back next time with another candid conversation about madness and grace. See you then.